Okay, everybody. My name is Merrill McBride, for those of you who don't know, and I have the pleasure of serving as your host today. I want to welcome you to this edition of the VWEC Expert Series, in which we ask educational professionals to share their experiences and their insights into ways in which virtual worlds can be used to engage students. I am pleased to introduce today's guest speaker, Phil Youngblood. He is a published research chemist, biochemist, career retired military officer, career retired university faculty member in computer science and cybersecurity with a doctorate in education, and he is equally comfortable with quantitative and qualitative research approaches and is an active retiree involved in multiple disparate pursuits in first and second life. Today we are in for a treat. Phil has marshaled his eclectic interest into a presentation on, quote, teaching critical thinking in natural worlds, end quote, a topic with widespread appeal in this day and age. He argues that teaching and learning topics in natural virtual worlds promotes critical thinking by creating an environment in which educators can control the amount of distracting noise, and learners can meet practitioners and collaborate with others worldwide. Please be advised that this presentation will be recorded and streamed on YouTube and will be fully captioned. Please see the instructions on the sign to my lower right that includes the URL. Feel free to post questions to chat during his talk, and either he will address them directly during his presentation, or we will collect them to be answered during our social time at the end of the hour. The co-host, Val, and I will monitor the chat. So, without further delay, I yield the floor to Phil.
Hi, thank you, Merrill, and thanks everyone for attending today. We've got quite part of the reason I wanted to do this was we've got kind of a steamed crowd. You all know this. In fact, I hope you are reading the Avatar Scholar. There's a little kiosk right behind the seats here. And so for purposes of people who may not be in the VWEC, one of the reasons I'm talking with you today is so that you can share successes, tackle obstacles in the area that I'll be talking about. I'm partly here for ulterior purposes, which is also to solicit some of your ideas. If you weren't here last year, in February, there was a presentation about the Avatar Scholar where several of the people who are in today were talking about it. Okay, so today's presentation is grounded in those purposes, the idea that we are here to share successes, tackle objects, showcase the educational potential for Second Life and other metaverse-based platforms. So I will be talking about the educational potential of these platforms to teach, and to think critically in virtual worlds, and then to also foster awareness of social and natural virtual worlds, which I'll explain, which aren't exclusionary spaces. In fact, you're actually sitting in one. If we were inside some building, that would be perhaps a social virtual world, but the fact is that we're out in nature and such, and there are added value for being out in a natural virtual world. One of the definitions of natural virtual world, another for me, is that things being out in their natural environment. Okay, so that's kind of the definition of that. I don't know all of the examples of natural virtual worlds that promote critical thinking, so that's part of why I'm here, because my abstract's been approved for an upcoming edition of the Avatar Scholar, and I'd like to pick your brains a little bit here. Okay, so now to expand on teaching philosophy is that, in other words, what I would like from you is we're all lifetime students. Okay, so students are not an interruption in what I'm doing. And I accomplish nothing without understanding what you're understanding or understanding what you're thinking. So please ask relevant questions in voice chat, make comments, all that good stuff. And then think about what I'm saying about critical thinking that applies to virtual worlds. The caveats are down there on the bottom, namely in the military, I used to have 3 or 4 radios, a radar screen, all kinds of stuff going all the time. And so I had to filter out what was important, make critical decisions, essentially practice critical thinking, problem solving skills for decades. I also, when I was not retired, I usually didn't. In fact, I never said that I score high on tests for neurodiversity. If you look at that in Google, you'll usually go, "Oh no, he's neurodiverse. We're going to have to be careful." But if you actually look at the advantages of it, it's like, whoa, okay, here's a job in Silicon Valley, because as neurodiverse, it's my superpower. Intense focus, exceptional pattern recognition, innovative problem solving, heightened creativity, and that comes straight from Google. Okay, this is kind of my outline for the article. The one part here that I will not need to address is what are virtual worlds, what are natural virtual worlds, because you guys are all here and you're doing this stuff. I will address the other points here. What is the problem? What's the problem cause? I'm going to start with the problem cause as I believe it. Formal education practices tend to focus on a topic, and in doing so, they isolate participants from the context, namely application and practitioners. I've never gone to work where they say, "Oh, we're just going to do algebra from 9 to 10 and Spanish from 10 to 11 and that sort of thing." You have to use all of everything to be able to solve problems at work. The other thing formal education practice tends to do is focus on the teacher. You can see in the iconic video, or in this case, that's probably AI, that basically it isolates participants from the environment and each other. There's walls so that you don't have noise, you don't have distractions, and in some places you don't have phones, whatever. Okay, so the problem then is that those educational practices tend to create a systematic problem by making it difficult for the students, A, to learn how to think critically, which requires being able to evaluate different sources. They usually get one source, either the teacher, the textbook, the whatever, and then so they're at a loss to begin with because they don't learn how to evaluate different sources and then filter out the noise, etc. And then it makes it difficult for students to make a logical inference or reasoned judgment about the meaning of information they encounter. So what is critical thinking? Well, one author I read said, we can't agree on what critical thinking is, which, okay, that's great, that's safe. There's lots of ways to look at it. But we might call it or define it as an analytical process to evaluate information in the environment. So as a process, you receive information, you collect it, you analyze it. By collect it, you're trying to filter out the information that is part of what you're looking at. If this sounds a lot like research, well, it is. By evaluate, you're observing, you're experiencing, you're reasoning, communicating, then reflecting. So the goal then is what I had on the other slide for critical thinking is to make a logical inference or a reasoned judgment about the meaning of information that you encounter. So why teach critical thinking? Well, it's complicated. And you can read those things, but if you look to the right, you'll see this is a recent survey from last year. Don't try to read the small print. I think it's probably kind of fuzzy anyway. But at the very top, this is from fall of 2025. And at the very top, employers in a survey, it was about 3,000 employers, that said problem-solving skills. are number one. And then, of course, work in a team, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So being able to solve problems is a marketable skill and it's part of just about every part of life. So from a practical standpoint, critical thinking helps to define a problem. And then problem solving then is the type of skill that employers and others want to see. The reason it's complicated is that most people don't question. In other words, most people, it isn't in our nature to think critically. Basically, we don't ask questions. If it appears to be true, well, great, it works for us. If there's a pattern, we don't ask if the pattern's really there or the story's true. We tend to get our own beliefs out of what, for a number of things. I'll talk about epistemology here in a minute, but belief tends to trump evidence. So we seek evidence to support our beliefs rather than create our beliefs from evidence. And I'm not, when I say we, as researchers know, I'm being general, however, if anyone would like to have any of the references, I've got a string of references to back up each one of these statements. These are the references for the slide before. And so this just isn't my own belief, but I have sought out multiple sources to be able to share this with you today. So in teaching critically, the other complication is that there's a lot of systems of belief. If you look at the left side of the slide, you'll see how you might, as a educator and researcher that has been through higher education, how you might look at it. Now, those are simple words. If you look deep, it goes, get with research and blah, blah, teams and conferences and stuff. But essentially, they're talking about like questioning people, interview, questioning, observing, listening, looking at what groups, particularly focus groups, say. Authorities, for sure. Your data. What data did they present? And I threw in AI right there. It says intelligence systems, which have actually been around since the 60s. AI is just the next iteration of it. Speaking as a computer science professor, practitioners like us here, research, database. What I mean by database is, okay, where's all the articles, all the different stuff that we tend to look at online in libraries, etc., or in our own library. Or for if you're not schooled in education and research, then your knowledge acquisition might look a little more like the one in the top middle. That is, okay, intuition. This is what I think feels like this. I have particular beliefs. Those beliefs may be based. Now, the difference between, of course, belief and faith. Let me just throw that out because I don't hear anybody and I don't see any chat. So I like to have chat and I like to have comments. So what's the difference between belief and faith? Just to throw that out. And I don't mean necessarily religious faith. That's maybe where some faith comes from. But how would you distinguish beliefs from faith?
Faith, you don't have to have proof, to where belief usually you do, right?
Yeah, it's something you believe. In other words, oh well, yeah. There you go. Okay, both of them can kind of be changed, although beliefs are something that you can call them theories, or maybe even a untested hypothesis, or things like that. In other words, this is what our current belief about the solar system or whatever is. Whereas, so in other words, okay, yeah, okay, there you go. Roy, I like that. Educated guess versus blind guess. And then other people are throwing up, like Val has there, with belief may be more intellectual. Faith requires. Oh, okay. Now there is a word of trust. There was a Indiana Jones and the whatever the last one was, where the main character stepped off onto what looked like a chasm and actually stepped onto a plank. That's faith. Okay. Belief is that if I step off on here, I'm going to kill myself. Okay. So in other words, there is a difference between the two. And okay, now we're getting a few nuances here. So in addition to intuition or belief or faith, then of course a lot of people look for tradition. In other words, like culture or their particular group that they're in, whether it's in school or a assisted living center. You've got authority, which hopefully is not just social media. You've got, okay, there you go, reasoning, your own experience, and then an empirical process. So if you look from a philosophical standpoint, then you've got different perspectives in realism. In other words, reality is objective. Nature's kind of uncertain. Reality examined, like what we're trying to do here, is better understood. Or you could say reality is only exists in the group I'm in, or realities created by us. I tend to be more of the realities created by us, which is why I'm talking with you guys. Okay, so let me give you an example with a couple real instances. Now, the reason I've got this build up here is that, as I mentioned, please be looking at what I'm sharing with you as it might apply to virtual worlds. Okay. So on the left, you've got the science. In other words, if you look underground or if you just move some leaves in a undisturbed forest area, you will see a mycorrhizal symbiosis. And if you actually put radioactive isotopes, etc., and follow where the water and nutrients and all that go, you'll see that they are exchanged between trees and plants and mushrooms and all this good stuff. And there is this network, this underground network. Now, if you look up in the top, slightly to the right, that nice kind of spider webby looking thing, that is actually a depiction of internet connections in a small area of the internet. Now, the interesting thing is, I on social media actually saw this on social media, and they were saying mycelial connection. And they were using this picture, and that's not true. This is a picture of the internet. Each one of those little things, those are nodes, like internet service providers, and then you have IPs at each, in other words, like your house, at each of the ends of that. Now, I'm a Trekkie. I love Star Trek, but in one of them, they came up with the idea of mycelial network as a way to travel from one place to another without, taking hours to do it or days to do it. I also am a fan of Avatar, but and I think it's a really cool thing, and it dates back basically to when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, where we're one with everything and stuff. But the other day, my wife went to a presentation that she thought was on mycelia connections, and they showed the picture like this. And she was going, and other people at the end were going, this isn't science. And she said, it's true to me, so it's science. So we have to be careful these days about critical thinking and sources and where our beliefs come from and things like that. Okay, so how do you teach critical thinking? Well, if you look at some sources, they'll say that you can't, at least you can't outside of a discipline. There's so much terminology and concepts and stuff that critical thinking is specific to a discipline. Other people going, no, there's some basic underlying skills which are transferable. In other words, you can say, this is critical thinking, much like I presented in an earlier slide. These are the types of things that we look at for critical thinking. And there other sources will go, okay, here's some ways to do it, is essentially you can take a complex problem, separate it out into simpler ones that then are more easily able to understand or to integrate, or you can see things that are similar. So, for example, you can compare two problems that have been diagrammed or been reduced to their simpler components that look like they may be different, but basically have the same deep structure. So for example, if you look at Merrill and you look at me, okay, you could say we're different, okay, but heart to heart, we have the same structure and the same. In other words, we have far more in common than our surface structure. Okay, authors also will say you can't just teach critical thinking as kind of an aside. You've got to teach it deliberately. In other words, have a class or have a partial portion of a class that's teaching critical thinking skills deliberately. Just like, in other words, like down at the bottom, it says, okay, great, you can enjoy food, but that doesn't mean you can cook. So theory is kind of like the yeast that helps make bread rise. You have to look at critical theory and practice it as itself. Okay, so how do you teach it? In classrooms, there are, and okay, I'm gonna ask the audience here too, is that here's a couple ways that it can be done. And why am I using those examples? Because I'm making the argument that in a typical classroom, you may not have a typical classroom, particularly in Second Life, but in a typical classroom, you've got the walls and the ceiling, and you've got proper lighting and chairs and a whiteboard, and everybody knows what to do because they've been there for years. And but does anyone remember their first field trip? Like, for example, I grew up in a city, so going to a dairy farm was my first field trip when I was young, and boy, was that enlightening. Anybody have a recollection of field trips that they did in school? A bread factory. Oh, talk about a sensory experience. Yeah, so that's where milk comes from. Well, the interesting thing is, yes, yeah, absolutely. Oh, water treatment plant. There, that's kind of like a bread factory, except not. Okay, my grandparents had a victory garden, and we used to go down to the victory garden. And the first time I said, pulled up a carrot, and I go, oh my goodness, that's where carrots. Yeah, there you go. Okay, village up in Connecticut. You pull up a carrot, and you go, oh, that's where carrots came from. So, oh, you grew up in a dairy farm. Okay. Later on, okay, now that's, in other words, the immersive ones where you get to really, just like in virtual worlds, where you get to immerse, those are the ones that are very valuable. Okay, so later on, you may get, and I know I used to, when I was a professor, I used to try to bring practitioners in to talk to the students, or perhaps going to some place where you could talk to them, or later on, students, in fact, I was the head of the program. I created the program for computers, information systems, and cybersecurity. And so it was a requirement to have an internship. In other words, to go see where, in its natural environment, where what you were learning fits in and how the persons that were doing it interacted with others, that sort of thing. So those are the conventional solutions. The problem with that is what? Field trips, internships, visits. What's a general problem with that in classes? Yeah, it's expensive. It takes time. It takes permission, depending on how old your students are. All of that. Yeah. Okay. There you go. That's an interesting one-time experience. Now we know that in virtual worlds you can go back and look at where you've been. So in other words, that's probably the last time I went to a dairy farm, to tell you the truth. It was when I was young. Okay, now that's interesting. If you do a lot of field trips, that's good. Marley, if you could expand in chat while I continue there. In other words, how are you able to do field trips, or is that just part of the practice where you are? So my proposed solution then is to teach and learn in user-created 3D virtual worlds. Now, that should not come as any surprise to the people here. So how do you do that? Now, bear in mind that in the Avatar Scholar, and even right here, there may be people who are not educators, but they're interested in the topic or interested in education. So that's why I'm bringing up some of these things that may be obvious to some of you, is that you look at what it is you're going to do, create a topic. Now, I'll show you a number of examples here shortly. But whatever your topic that you're studying, you create it then within its natural environment, or a facsimile of it, obviously, in virtual worlds. And then you can also control the amount of noise. Now, by noise, I don't necessarily mean noise as in sound. What I mean is noise can be objects. Let's see, I don't think, excuse me, I don't think I see Delia here. No, but Delia, when she does field trips, she asks us about, okay, what are you seeing here? What's related? What that sort of thing. And it's amazing what people see and don't see depending on how they're viewing. So by noise I mean is that what is around and where is the topic that you're looking at? Say it's ducks. Okay, where are they? Are those other things ducks? Where that what I mean by noise. Noise can also mean smells or uh, um, any part of our senses. And then virtual worlds. Then you want to enable learners to immerse themselves. You don't immediately necessarily want to give them the answer. You want them to go in and observe and explore and reflect on what they're looking at and meet people and collaborate other worldwide. So let's take a look at then learning in virtual worlds. So studies reveal that being able to come into a eco-psychologist, that's a word I have not encountered yet. That's cool. One of it is different for. Oh, there you go. Hey, right now, if we were to stand up and walk around the island, you would be in, and if you're here, she would talk about it, is different forests and have us, feel in different environments and stuff. And there's a lot of examples in Second Life, everything from beaches to alpine meadows to swamps to whatever. So you don't necessarily have to create it yourself if you're familiar with some of the environments that we have here. In fact, actually, what is it? Anybody participate in Virtual World's Best Practices Education? They've got a lot of islands, which they're going to use again this year in March, and they run the full gamut of different environments, much like what Marley's saying. Okay, that's worth take a look at what Roy is saying. So studies have shown that there is a beneficial psychological effect of being able to create an avatar of your choice and then come into a virtual world, which in the study of virtual worlds, that's basically presence. In other words, feeling that you're here. And then if you're with other people, social presence. In other words, not wanting to bump into them, not being polite, that sort of thing, much like we're doing here. And by feeling that you're in an area that you recognize, it can counter online isolation and keep people engaged in the environment the same way that they might with the physical world without the stick part of the carrot and the stick. In other words, you're in a place, but then allowing them to be able to create their own experiences, communicate, interact. That concept there actually came from one of the articles in the Avatar Scholar from last year. Okay, thanks, Roy. These are, let's see, 2 jobs hold lower the odds of dying from Alzheimer's. Really? Okay, so I'll take a look at some of these. Okay, so virtual worlds, my argument here, virtual worlds can support both formal, that is classroom, this is essentially formal, non-formal, like field trips, museums, internships, peer-to-peer. Okay, we're not necessarily formal. Why would we be peer-to-peer rather than formal? In a formal one, you tend to have a teacher-student. Okay, we don't really have teacher-students. We have like teacher, student here, right? Because I have a feeling, looking at the audience and knowing a lot of the people in the audience, that a lot of us this isn't our first rodeo with respect to either virtual worlds or teaching critical thinking or teaching or learning in virtual worlds. So it's more of a peer-to-peer relationship. And then, of course, life itself is informal education. Okay, so let's recap before we look at some of the examples of teaching in natural virtual worlds. Remember that the goal is to be able to create the ability to look at things or to logically or reasoned meaning of whatever it is that you're seeing, information. If it's a classroom type environment, then it's like, okay, ducks. Okay, so that's the subject. So what is the meaning of what you're seeing with regards to the ducks? As far as environment, where they are, whether they move, and how they're, all of that sort of thing. How many of them are, and the social and colors, and why the colors. In other words, all of the different types of things associated with ducks. Okay. The activities that you might use in virtual worlds, depending on who's out there, is of course dependent on age, and then the familiarity with the subject. You can be a little more exploratory if people are already familiar with the subject, and you could be looking for examples, for example, or your need for control. In other words, there again, based on age and where you are and that sort of thing. But you can, as I mentioned, in virtual worlds, you can have a classroom, kind of like this, except that I actually think of this more peer-to-peer. And so it supports all of those different types of educations. Now, from the teacher standpoint, then you can create the context. In other words, you're studying about ducks. I don't know why I picked ducks. I remember some of the Delia's field trips. So you can create what you're studying by looking at how it's applied. In other words, the duck out from where it's supposed to be. You can control how much environment there is. Now, I want to reiterate this. This is the special environment of virtual worlds. You don't have to go to a natural environment and then try to pick out a duck. You can create the environment yourself, which means you can control the noise or the amount of noise and reduce and then by doing so, you can reduce a complex problem like the environment for ducks, and then compare a similar one, ducks in one place, ducks in another. For the learner side, then you're observing, experiencing, analyzing what you're seeing, and then evaluating different places where ducks. I don't want to concentrate on ducks. Okay, so now And then everybody basically is immersing, engaging, interacting, communicating, reflecting, reasoning. So we are looking at all that. Now, this is a recap. So when we talk about actual virtual environments, think about all these different ways of looking. So I'm going to take a look at these different ways here right now. When I first got started in Second Life, this is back 2008, 2009 time period, is that I started looking at it from my university standpoint. Is that we had in our school an architectural program, and it's one thing for a student to sit down and draw a really nice architectural design of a house, but it's quite the opposite. And I talked to the teacher and I go, you know what I could do? I could actually create this and show you, and then walk in, uh, open the door, ring the doorbell, and then go down the hall. And so, what could you get from actually going into a house, and particularly in virtual world where you can change things? What could you get out of that that you couldn't get out of an architectural diagram, for example, architectural drawing? Perspective in what way? You can do voice or chat. That's fine. Okay, view from within. Okay, you're right. In other words, you kind of got this overview or side view or perspective view or whatever from an architectural drawing. But if you actually are immersed in the house, so what might you learn from viewing it from within?
That you may not particularly like the architecture from within,
That you may not
particularly
say that again.
like the architecture from within, the way it's created inside.
Yeah, in other words, okay, maybe the hall's too narrow.
Mm.
Maybe you put maybe you put a door where you didn't want to. Maybe you put the door opening in or out. Maybe it should have carpet. Maybe it should have different colors. Maybe the ceiling's too high or low, or the fireplace doesn't have a proper whatever it is that you're supposed to have with fireplaces, that sort of thing. So you can actually, much like, so in a virtual world where you have an object that may be too large to build, too expensive to build, yeah, it doesn't fit properly, exactly. You can then be able to see those things in a virtual world far better than you could just in a diagram. And you'd be surprised how enlightening that is for students. Okay, my third or fourth international class was also in 2009, 2010. And what I did was I was teaching Java programming. This is down the bottom. These are a couple of views from there. I'm a somewhat of a pack rat. I don't throw away stuff, so I could still find the images from 2009. Is I was co-teaching a class with a professor, a computer science professor in France. And so he had his students, we had our students. We had I don't know, a blog or something online where students could post anything in either French or English. They were in teams, and they had to come up with objects that they could program using Linden scripting language, and then look. There was kind of had to look at that versus Java, and so they came up with some very interesting stuff. They came up with that robot there on the left, and it actually was able to move and talk. They came up with a flying airplane. They came up with a jukebox. It's amazing. And I also had some students from. I was on a Fulbright trip down to Mexico in 2004, and so I got with the University of Monterey, and there were students there. Yeah, no carbon monoxide. But then that's one of the advantages of virtual worlds. In other words, you can't be hurt physically. And so I had some students from Mexico. It was really fun to do that class, but I kind of left it, in other words, I kind of left it open for them to do the exploration, to talk together, to uh, look at different sources of how-to and codes, and they had never been in Second Life. So they had to learn how to build and talk with each other and compare and share and all that stuff like that. One of the first things I did, and I need to have another image in there, but you can also in virtual worlds be able to do things where perhaps there's either potentially hazardous events or where it may be difficult to access. So, for example, in the first years in Second Life, I was exploring around and I found a mosque. And so I walked into a mosque and talked with a person who was in dress and asked that person, well, the first thing, okay, so I walked into the mosque, and speaking of presence, social presence, place presence, what do you think the first thing they asked me to do in a mosque? Yeah, excellent. Okay. Yeah, two people. Wow. Okay. So people are, yeah, they're exactly. Okay. Wow. All in one. Yeah, that's exactly right. Which for me as a newbie there in Second Life, that was amazing. That was great. The fact that that people were taking the place seriously, and actually I was learning something from a cultural perspective. Although I had actually been to places like Istanbul and other places when I was in the Navy, but also I could talk with the person and say, "Why? What is the band on your headdress mean? What is all that?" And they were perfectly candid with me about what it meant, and I was able to learn a great deal. And then there was a place that had a Korean temple, which looked a lot like the temple that is at the University of Hawaii campus where I did my undergrad and other research. But you can also like sit down and play an instrument, and then you can. So where does critical thinking come in? Well, first of all, you can visit different places that are claimed to represent these areas. You can go, okay, is that really the way that that instrument, if you were a music class, is that really the way it sounds? Uh, would these instruments be together? Um, in other words, does the temple? Why does this temple? What does this temple represent? How does it represent it in other uh, places? All that good stuff, like all of which you can find in Second Life. Now, this one chemistry world is Mike here. Just check. Okay, Mike Shaw, one of the Science Circle members. He has a sim called Chemistry World, and he uses it for his students, and they go there, and it's potentially they can do things which might be potentially hazardous, both from the chemical standpoint, and then he can go through procedures. By clicking on those little red dots, you actually go up to a platform, and you can do scientific experiments and not blow up the place, all of that. So and then compare things and the rest in world. So one of the things also is that in the science circle, we tend to go on field trips in June and December. And one of there was about 4 field trips which I led that went from nature. In other words, it was all about human nature interface. And so from nature where there was no humans and no human impact to that Monarch Education Project, where it's a valley and you can see how the monarch butterflies down in Mexico live, and you're going down paths and intruding as little as possible on nature there, all the way to the far end there, Kowloon. Anyone been to Kowloon? Just where basically it. Okay, there you go. Yes, so it's really difficult to find a plant, period, or anything. Well, Kowloon there is on the other side of the bay or the harbor from Hong Kong proper. It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. But it's very interesting. You can go there Second Light. They've turned it in, I think, to a combat center, but you can still go in and take a look at it. Okay, Matt, how could we talk about critical thinking and education stuff without mentioning Genome Island? Is that one of the things you can do in virtual worlds is to look at things which are inaccessible. I mentioned inaccessible culture, that sort of thing, but also because DNA is microscopic, you can look at it in context. That's Gregor Mendel's Abbey there, and you can walk through it and take a look at what he may have been thinking, and then do experiments. There's the famous Cattery on the right. Max talked about Genome Island in a expert series last year, and where you can go and you can then use what you know to be able to mix match the males and females and see what you get as an offspring. And then a little more focus is that large tower in the back where you can compare DNA from eukaryotic cells versus prokaryotic cells and humans versus other primates, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, the big cell, of course. So much to see. If you haven't been to Genome Island, I would highly recommend going there. Okay. You can also go to places in Second Life where it's inaccessible because either in time, in other words, way back when, or you can't go there yet because it's off world. So, for example, you can go to the Titanoboa exhibit, which is on Science Circle Island over on down near Chemistry World. You've got a marvelous immersive environment with sounds and little creatures and rain and all of that there. This is one of Delia's marvelous, one of Delia's marvelous creations where you can go back in time. The only thing you can't do is like feel the heat and the humidity there. Also, every Monday, I facilitate discussions about what it would be like to have a base on the moon. And this is a platform that looks like the moon up at high, and we built a place for the virtual world practice education. Now, this is for World Space Week. That basically where we're looking at 16 different environments. So, in other words, we get groups together and people are there. Roy Tagline, for example, in the audience, and Max often, and other people visit. And I hope I didn't miss anybody out. And we talk about the moon base from their perspective. So you've got, and it's international. You've got people from all over the place. And in this case, we're looking at 16 different environments. Everything from a submarine, that the part there that you see is actually a full-sized middle part of the submarine. So you can see how tight the living quarters is and that sort of thing. And then we're also looking at, and we talked about, say, the Amundsen Scott base at South Pole, and all of the different, there's about 16 different places that we were looking at, and how they might be different or the same as a moon base. Okay, that's my presentation. I'd like to entertain, unless we're headed someplace, I'd like to entertain questions, thoughts, comments. Other places you've been?
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time for comments. Let me get through some additional material here, then I'll open things up. And I apologize, I have to leave at the top of the hour because of an RL commitment I didn't know I had. But Val Librarian agreed in advance to stay with you and as you go to the back and so forth and participate in the questions. But what I want to say, Phil, is first of all, a hearty thank you for this presentation. And I know that the group, like I I did, enjoyed listening. His slides will be available on the slides and information wall behind us and to my right. I loaded the slides before we began this afternoon, so I know they're there. Now's the time to adjourn to the deck at the back of the venue to address questions captured in chat and elaborate any questions and answers and comments that were provided during the presentation. Before we do that, however, please note that the next installment of the VWEC Expert Series will be on February 13th, 1 o'clock SLT, at which time we will look at the VR Exploders Club and examine why we should care about other social immersive platforms. So mark your calendars. Finally, you can find links to our in-world calendar and related helpful information in the material that I will add to the text chat. And we can be reached through a variety of media. Once again, please look at your text chat. Please join Val as we adjourn to our social space at the back deck, where you can imbibe in all sorts of alcoholic non-intoxicants and indulge your sweet tooth with calorie and sugar-free treats. So in terms of the formal presentation, we stand adjourned, but we'll be more than happy to continue the conversation with Phil on a more informal basis at the back. So again, Phil, thank you very much for coming and for sharing with us. And we look forward to the next time. Everybody, have a great weekend.
Okay, and bear in mind that one of the reasons I shared this with you is to get some information about your experiences so I can expand and explain the actual virtual environments that I put up there and others, which you will see in the Avatar Scholar later on.
Thanks for the plug.